because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are. And we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a podcast where we explore the philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin.
I'm Laura.
And today we're digging into a 90s neo-noir thriller made by two, well, shall we say, problematic individuals. It's The Usual Suspects. And since we'll be discussing the ethics of engaging with art by people who've done morally bad things, we felt we needed an expert on the topic. So we're joined today by a professor of philosophy at Wellesley and author of the new book, Drawing the Line, What to Do About the Work of Immoral Artists from Museums to Movies. Welcome, Erich Hatala Matthes.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks for being here, Erich. And so I want to start out today by asking all of us here. So when did you first see the film? And second question, revisiting it today, how has your relationship changed to the film?
So I was thinking about this. So I know I didn't see The Usual Suspects in theaters because when it came out, I was around 10 and I did not have the most permissive parents with respect to R-rated theater adventures when I was 10 years old. So I know I didn't see it then. I think I saw it on video a couple years later, like maybe when I was like 13 or 14. I know I saw it when I was like a young teenager because I remember it being a really sort of formative movie watching experience. So, I think I grabbed it at Blockbuster and watched it. Remember Blockbuster? And watched
I miss Blockbuster.
And watched it at home. And I was trying to think, I was like, well, did I watch this with anybody? Because I know I subsequently watched it with people many times because it's one of those movies that is so much fun to watch with somebody who's watching it for the first time when you've already seen it. Because of the nature of the movie and the big sort of reveal. I assume that given that this is a 90s movie, we're not going to avoid spoilers in this conversation.
I should have said that. Yeah, I should have said that at the beginning that we are going to fully spoil this movie. So if you have any interest in seeing the movie like spoiler free and you for some reason haven't seen this movie yet, look, it's what I'm about to say is going to be philosophically fraught, but I'm going to say go see the movie and then and then come back.
And then come back and listen to us talk about whether or not you should have seen that movie.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. But yes, there will be spoilers. Sorry, continue, Eric.
Yeah. So, I mean, I definitely remember watching this movie for the first time and just completely having my mind blown by the ending. And it was funny because I rewatched it this morning and I found myself asking myself like, oh, like, was I just like some sort of, naive, impressionable teenager that I was taken in by this movie? Like, is the reveal really as good as it seemed to me? And of course, that's an impossible question to answer. But I know that when I saw it when I was a teenager, I was like, wow, yeah. I did not see that coming and was just sort of bowled over by it. And then, one of the things I definitely remember, I think that's made this movie really stand out to me over the years is that I remember after that going to see a slew of totally forgettable movies in the theaters when I was a teenager that were just trying to follow The Usual Suspects script. Yep. And they generally all failed, right? So, I mean, I couldn't even tell you what they were because they were literally forgettable movies. But I know I saw them because I remember leaving theaters and being like, oh, they tried to do a Usual Suspects and it kind of sucked. Like it didn't really work. I think maybe one of the later movies that was pretty successful in this regard was probably The Sixth Sense, as sort of pulling a Usual Suspects in a way that still sort of like got people as opposed to feeling like a knockoff. So I watched this movie many times as a teenager, like I said, sort of often like when I could find somebody who hadn't seen it yet, because it was just fun to see them sort of like experience what you experienced, being sort of like shocked by the reveal. but I don't think I'd seen it in a very long time. So it was definitely interesting to sort of rewatch it.
So you were saying, I mean, did it hold up in terms of did you feel like you were not taken in, that it was a good twist and not just a cheap twist?
I still think it's good. I mean, it's like you can't like put that toothpaste back in the tube. It's like what's coming.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But no, I think it's still good. I think it's still good. And I think that there's so many things I liked about the movie. I mean, we can talk more about it because some of it has to do with the with some of the darker sides,
the controversy.
Viewing it in retrospect.
I think that's a good starting point. I mean, Laura, first time you saw this was with me, right? I forced you to watch it.
I don't know. I can't remember if I'd seen it in high school or not, but for sure we watched it many years ago.
Yeah.
And you were really excited to show it to me. I think I had already known about the ending because it's like you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. To your point, like it's one of those things like The Sixth Sense where everybody sort of like knows the twist.
The problem is that it gets parodied in movies like Scary Movie, which you had probably seen, and so then the images have been recycled and repackaged so that now you're like, oh, I see what's going on. Right.
Yeah. So that is unfortunate that perhaps I watched it before, when I already sort of knew about the Kaiser Soze twist.
Yeah.
It's funny you brought up Sixth Sense because I didn't love it as much as I thought I was going to love it this time around. And I don't think it's necessarily bringing in, ill feelings towards Bryan Singer or Kevin Spacey. I think it's just not a very emotional movie, and I am a very emotional person, and The Sixth Sense makes me cry so hard. Like, it's like a melodrama. Like,
Sure.
I just love that movie for all of its, like, sincere, intense emotion. And this movie is, like, super smart and written, and the characters aren't very fleshed out, and there isn't a lot of an emotion, and, like, it doesn't resonate as much with me.
Yeah. That's fair.
That's all.
I think my experience was closer to Eric's. I mean, I think when I saw this, it was not in theaters. Same. We're about the same age, and when I saw it for the first time, it was probably in high school, which would have been a few years after it was released. And I remember there were a few movies that I would liked that. Sixth Sense was so saturated that you couldn't really have that thing that you were talking about, Eric, of being like, oh, you haven't seen The Sixth Sense. Let me show you. Yeah. It was everyone, even if they hadn't seen it, they knew the twist. But this one, a lot of people would not have known the twist for whatever. It just, it didn't make as much money. It wasn't as seen. And so I would show people this like you. And then the other one I would always show people is Memento. That was the other one that was just like, let's show. And Fight Club 2 was one that I wasn't as so totally into Fight Club as those other two that I mentioned, but people I knew that would be the one they would put on. And I think, again, a lot for the twist and for kind of watching as much the audience as they are watching the action on the screen. But I mean, watching it today, I think I also agree with you, Eric. I think it does hold up. I mean, I think that to your point, Laura, it is an incredibly smart movie, but it's unlike, I think, a lot of movies that are trying to just be smart for their own sake to just, like, I don't know, get one over on the audience. I feel like this movie is trying to do something a little bit more interesting because there's this parallelism that I'm going to talk about later between the character played by Kevin Spacey, his name is Verbelkind, and then the detective who's interrogating him, Dave Kuyan, and the director of the film, Bryan Singer, and the audience. Right? There's this parallelism between the two, and that deception that's happening is happening in, there are connections that you can draw between what's happening in the deception between Verbal and Kuyan and the deception that's happening between Singer and the audience. And so I think, and I think this is actually made even more strange and rich in a way which is where we're going next, these allegations come out and you learn that these two guys, Spacey and Singer, who are at the center of the deception of this movie, turned out to have been basically deceiving the public, and for a long period of time. In case of Kevin Spacey, for decades. And I think it's really, I mean, I find watching the movie now, it's weird to say that it like enriches it. It doesn't really enrich it, but it adds another layer, a meta narrative layer that I had never seen, because this was the first time we were watching the movie, I think, in light of the allegations. And so it's so much more, it resonated so much more with me. It's a little bit like watching someone who is a really bad person act out being bad, and they're getting like a sick, pleasure from it almost.
Mm-hmm. But you also were pointing out the ways in which the reveal, a twist movie doesn't sort of just made or break by the writing, by the way that the screenplay. It's also the direction. And you were talking about, like, you felt like Bryan Singer did a really good job visually, bringing you through that reveal. And I think Bryan Singer has talked about in interviews how like they couldn't crack it really. They were having trouble with that final scene, and they were with intercutting back and forth, and he was basically like sleeping in the editing bay trying to figure it out before he sort of realized that you needed to see some images of Kevin Spacey as Kaiser Soze. Like, but he was playing with it a lot to try and figure out how you get that maximum punch visually, and you feel like it works totally.
I do feel like it works. I mean, Christopher McQuarrie, who wrote the film, won the best screenplay award, and Kevin Spacey won best supporting actor. And Singer, I don't even think was nominated for director, but I actually think Singer does a very good job directing.
Yeah, that shot where Verbal is walking in the sidewalk and his limp turns into sort of a regular stride is like, I feel like that when I first saw it, that was the moment where I was like, oh, what? I mean, because like they've already laid out the pieces and you kind of already like see what's happening, but I feel like that's really where the punch comes, and I still think that shot is just like, yeah, fantastic. And then, he sort of like stretches out his hand. And,
it's so iconic, partly because you've already seen him fail to light a cigarette, right? Because he dropped the lighter in the office, and you've already seen Soze via these flashbacks, whatever we're seeing, light the cigarette again with the left hand. Right. It's always with the left hand. That's what I think is actually quite brilliant about the film, is he's using the visual language against us, right? He's using these things, and I'll come back to this again and again. We'll get into this in more detail, but that's just an example of using I'm going to draw attention to Soze's left hand, and I'm going to draw attention to Verbal's left hand. And then when I show you, he can actually use his left hand the way Soze did, you're like, fuck. It's like, it's all, it's a punctuation on everything that, you have to go back and you're like, oh shit, I got to go back and check it all out now and see how it fits together.
Yeah. And I think those visuals also are really effective in the sort of the bookending of the shots on the boat, right? Where like the opening scene of the movie, right? You've got the sort of like zooming in on sort of that pile of like ropes and other things, and like in the shot of the window with the sort of like spray from the murder that you don't know about yet, and then that all comes back right at the end of the movie and sort of like puts a point on how those images are going to get reframed, right? When you're showing them again, and you're really showing them again twice, right? Because you're showing them again, or I guess 3 times, right? Like you're showing them again, sort of like in this sort of real time, right? Like as the events are happening, right? And then replayed again as if Keaton is Soze, and then sort of again as if Verbal is Soze, and so just like getting that sort of like repetition of those visual elements, but shown to you in a different narrative context, I think is really effective.
Totally. Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's so many things I want to say about this, but I think we have to get into the now unfortunate context of where we are in this movie, because we are going to talk at length about, I think, some of the, brilliant parts of the movie. I have to say, it is quite brilliant. But the thing that I think the three of us, and I think anyone who knows about what's gone on in the context surrounding Spacey and Singer, I think is going to feel a certain degree of uncomfortableness watching this film and saying some of the things that I and maybe others are going to say about it. That is a good film, and that it is an achievement artistically. And that's because, as we're going to explain in some detail for the audience, as long as, just in case they aren't up on what's happened, there have been some very serious allegations made against both Kevin Spacey and Bryan Singer. So Laura, you read a bunch of articles on this.
I read so many articles, which was a tough night. I don't want to linger like too long on the details of this because I want to, talk about the philosophy. And there's so many well-researched articles and person narratives available.
Yeah.
So, go look at that if you want to know more. But I did also want to share a content warning in summarizing some of their behavior, that I'll mention sexual assault, abusive relationships, and substance abuse, as well as struggles with mental health. So I'll give a summary of what I read. So Bryan Singer had long been known in Hollywood for keeping the company of younger men, and he was known for big raucous parties. And I think for some young men in Hollywood trying to break in, it was a chance to get their foot in the door in the industry if you could go to one of Bryan Singer's parties. And if you catch his eye. And that was kind of it in the 90s. He was just known for these big parties. In 1998, there were some allegations about misconduct involving minors on the set of his film Apt Pupil. But as BuzzFeed points out in a 2014 article, the curiosity and rumors about Singer's social life at that time often had a tone of homophobic shaming. It was more like about his social life. That was, I mean, there were some, murmurings that he liked underage men, but for the most part, I think it was just the big Hollywood gay parties. But in 2014, Michael Egan filed a lawsuit alleging that Singer and two other men had drugged and repeatedly sexually assaulted him in 1999 when Egan was 15 years old. Singer's lawyers were successful in discrediting Egan, as certain details of his story were found untrue. And in the eyes of Hollywood studio directors, this seemed to put the issue to rest. And he continued to direct the X-Men series and then had the support of the surviving members of Queen to direct the biopic Bohemian Rhapsody. But in 2017, just after he had left the set of Bohemian Rhapsody, a second lawsuit was filed by Cesar Sanchez Guzman, alleging that Singer raped him in 2003 when Cesar was 17 years old. Then at that point, more accounts came out from Singer's past partners, describing Singer as an abusive partner. And these accounts describe a pattern in which Singer took young, often underage men under his wing and provided them with financial support and industry opportunities in exchange for sex and companionship. And these young men were often far from their families and didn't have financial stable situations. And so Singer would exploit this and entering into abusive relationships with them. Many of the men who had been these past partners struggled with PTSD, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse for years after their relationships with Singer ended. Meanwhile, Kevin Spacey's personal life had been far more private than Bryan Singer's. Until in 2017, Anthony Rapp, an actor who's in Rent, came forward with the statement that Spacey had assaulted him in 1986 when Rapp was 14 years old. And after that, more than 30 people came forward to share their own stories of sexual harassment and assault by Kevin Spacey, and these allegations span decades. The majority of the young men who came forward worked at the Old Vic Theatre in London, where Kevin Spacey was artistic director from 2004 to 2015. Much as with the stories around Bryan Singer, several employees of the Old Vic spoke about how Kevin Spacey's behavior was an open secret, and everyone involved was involved in keeping it quiet. Although, of course, the official statement from the theater was that they had been unaware. In the aftermath of these allegations, Spacey's character was killed off from House of Cards, and Ridley Scott pulled off the badass move recasting him completely and reshooting all of his scenes and all the money in the world. And in 2018, Kevin Spacey issued an extremely strange short film, I guess.
Yeah, let me be frank.
Let me be frank.
Let me be frank.
But I think we haven't really heard from Spacey since that.
So, okay, there's a lot of stuff here. And obviously we're not investigative journalists, so we're not in a position to, verify this. We trust the alleged victims and their stories. But we're going to operate for this discussion under the assumption that many of these stories are true and that this is a pattern of behavior, so that these two guys have done very bad things and in their personal lives. And so in light of that, Eric, we wanted to just start with the following question, which is just mainly an invitation for you to start to walk us through some of the complexity of this issue. But I'm going to ask it in a naive way, which is, in light of these allegations, and that the assumption that these guys have done bad things, can we in good conscience watch and enjoy this film? Does it affect just the question of whether we should be even watching it, whether we should be recommending it to people, and so on? So yeah, tell us how at least you think about that question.
Yeah. So, I think that if we're asking the question about just us as sort of like individual consumers, I think we're going to get a different answer than if we ask the question about people who are in positions of power in the film industry. So, like when you were talking about like Ridley Scott and the badass move of just like recasting Spacey from his movie In Progress, I think that's a great example of the kind of thing that people in positions of power can do, right? Where they can make clear that they're going to repudiate this kind of behavior, and they're just not going to work with people who are predators. Which I think it's always important to remember that like that would be the normal response in most regular work situations, right? If you knew somebody was a predator, you would not work with them. If you were in a position of authority, right, you would take steps to like remove them from your organization. It's the fact that we're dealing with celebrities here that I think even sort of puts the sort of question on the table. So I think that Scott's move is fantastic, right? He's the one who's in the position of power here, and he says like, nope. Even though I've already shot this movie, I'm going to go these extra steps to make sure that Kevin Spacey is not in it. And that's pretty remarkable, right? Because that's going to be a significant financial cost for him to do. So in contrast, us just sort of like individual arts consumers, I think that we have a lot more moral latitude when it comes to our decisions about what art to engage with. And partially that's because we're not in a position to make those kinds of tangible differences that that Ridley Scott or somebody in a position of authority in the art world can make. So that doesn't mean that I think that like there are sort of no moral questions that individuals face, but I think they're different ones. So I think that generally people who try to sort of frame the question about what individuals ought to do in terms of like making a difference, like sticking it, to the bad actor, not giving them your money, those kinds of things. I don't find those particularly compelling because it really doesn't feel like we're in a position to make those kinds of differences, because these cases are like, lots of other cases of individual action where you really need collective action, right? Where it's like, it just doesn't matter whether or not I stream Usual Suspects today on Amazon, right? It's like, it's irrelevant from a consequentialist perspective. It doesn't make a difference, right? But of course, there are other ways that things can matter morally besides making a difference. So I do think that we need to think about, what kinds of messages we might send through our artistic choices sometimes, right? We need to think about, whether engaging with certain work in certain contexts might, lead, for instance, like victims of assaults, right, in these cases to feel like ignored, right, unheard, dismissed, right? I think those are really important. So, I think that when it comes to, me watching a movie at home by myself, I think I can kind of watch whatever I want. There might be some exceptions at the borders, but I think that generally speaking, I have a lot of moral latitude. Would I right now, knowing what I know about Singer, organize like a Bryan Singer film festival? No, no, I would not do that, because that would have a certain public meaning to it, right? It would communicate something, right, to the public, even if it's not something that I intend, that I think I have good moral reason to ignore, right? Which is the potential implicit suggestion that I think that the quality of this movie or other Singer movies, right, makes up for the fact that he did these terrible things, right? Which I don't think, right? And I wouldn't want to communicate that.
So there were two sort of streams that I'm going to just tease apart slightly. So one stream is like the consequentialist stream. So the thought would be, well, sometimes people say things like, look, I don't want to give that guy my money. There's like, that's the reason you shouldn't watch his movies, because you're getting giving him their money. And I think to that, your response is apt. I mean, you're giving them very it's minuscule, and your tiny little withholding is not going to do very much. And then the other sort of stream is, what does a certain public viewing of a movie or exaltation of a movie end up communicating potentially, right? Even if you're not intending to communicate this, what could it end up communicating? And it could have ended up communicating something which is quite negative, right, towards potentially the survivors of this, or just survivors of sexual assault generally, that like that you don't care about it, or that it's not worthy of any change in your behavior or something like that. So I wanted to go back actually to the consequentialist thing first. So one thought that I had was that, well, you're right that we individuals not in Hollywood don't have any immediate power over the decisions about who works in Hollywood. And people like Ridley Scott do, which maybe puts Ridley Scott under a greater obligation than it does us to do something about this. One thing that has become clear in the last, 5 or 6 years with Me Too and other movements is that when individuals feel empowered to come out and tell their stories, and that there be, large scale consumer threat of like sanctioning a certain artist, that is driven largely by not the people in the boardrooms, right? Like Ridley Scott, by people on the street, like us, right? It's our, coming to surround a person who's been a victim and say, we are in solidarity with you. And we think that as a result, we're going to pressure, however that's going to be, maybe through economically or through on Twitter by being, by retweeting stuff or whatever, put public pressure on the studio, that is people like Ridley Scott, from hiring people like Kevin Spacey. So there is this sort of, I feel like there is a bit of a tension here, because I agree that on the one hand, like my individual action doesn't do it. But on the other hand, I might think it's good to engage in some kind of campaign, right? Whereby, like, if I may just use the term loosely, cancellation campaign, because that can have good effects. And then it would be, although I could do that and still watch the movie, but there would be some kind of like pragmatic or moral contradiction there, right? I would be hypocritical in a sense, because I'd be saying like, let's not watch this guy's movie, and then I'd be privately watching the movie. And so I wonder if that is a reason why maybe we shouldn't actually engage with these artists' art.
Yeah, so I think you would definitely lack integrity if you were out there advocating that we boycott a movie and then privately you were watching that movie on your own. That seems clearly not like a morally upstanding thing to do. So I don't want to say that there's no reason to engage in public or collective actions or to express solidarity with victims. I think there's all kinds of important things that we can do in that space. I think I'm more skeptical that boycotts in particular, or the idea that we should like rip a particular artist's work out of our lives, are going to be effective means of engaging in those kinds of expressions of solidarity. So I think that for a number of different reasons. One is just that boycotts of artists don't seem like they've actually been particularly effective. So it's interesting that Kevin Spacey really seems to have like gotten, kicked out of Hollywood, so to speak. I'm not sure that we can give like the public credit for that, because it would be really puzzling why the public was successful with Kevin Spacey and not successful in so many other cases. So like if you look, for instance, and I mentioned this in the book, like on the heels of these like really shocking sort of documentaries about Michael Jackson and R. Kelly, and other figures who have engaged in sort of similar morally problematic behavior, we actually didn't really see like engagement with those artists go down. Like actually the sort of like streaming engagement with Michael Jackson and R. Kelly after these documentaries like went up dramatically, like over 100%. So
wow.
It's not so clear that sort of like these kinds of public statements or sort of pressure from the public are actually effective at achieving the goals that they might set out to. I do think that it can be valuable for people to engage in collective action related to institutional reform, right? So rather than focusing on saying like, oh, get rid of this artist, nobody should watch this guy's work because he's a predator. Rather, trying to put pressure on people who are in positions of power in the industry to make changes that will hopefully prevent them from working with predators in the future, right? Not just this guy, but like predators in general, right? Trying to agitate for change, right, in the industry that could hopefully be beneficial in the future. So I think I'm more in favor of that kind of morally significant collective action than collective action that's geared towards oh, we should boycott this person's work and not watch it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm suggesting is that the two are linked, and that, in maybe boycotts that are backwards looking are less relevant, but the threat of I'm not going to buy the new R. Kelly record could be the kind of thing which leads to a kind of institutional reform. And I'm not totally sure really what the causal genesis of a lot of this stuff is, but kind of my, very minimal understanding of the Me Too movement is that there is at least a perceived threat of a kind of boycott of like what this artist is going to do next. And so that could be a contributing factor, at least, to them ceasing to be hired, And
I think that's a good distinction. And I think that that sort of focus on sort of the future work of somebody, future purchases, like that kind of position does seem like it has more promise than the more blanket, which I think is sort of more characteristic of, so-called like cancellation efforts, to say sort of like, oh, let's just sort of like act as if this person never made this work, in the first place, right? And, people shouldn't, watch, The Usual Suspects, to bring it back to our topic today, right? Even when, that's not sort of supporting Bryan Singer financially in any morally significant way. So I think that maybe we can render those two consistent with each other. And I think, when I think about it, I think I've done that in aspects of my own relationship with certain artists. So I write in the book quite a bit about my relationship with Woody Allen movies, which I was raised on and have a lot of affection for. And, in some ways, those are even more troubling because aspects of of Woody Allen's life are even more explicit, right, in the films. But the ones that I still like, right, like Love and Death, which is like one of my favorite movies, right, is a movie that I feel like I can maintain my affection for while consistently saying, like, I'm not seeing any more Woody Allen movies. It's like I haven't seen a Woody Allen movie in like a decade, and I'm not going to. Right. So I think we can sort of walk that line.
Yeah. And I think that is what has slowly happened, because his movies, even, I don't know when, I mean, those allegations have been around for a while with him. And I mean, at least the sort of general creepiness stuff has been around for a long time. But it wasn't until Me Too really took off that the movies really took a nosedive in terms of, like, to the point where then Rainy Day in New York didn't even get a release in the US it was delayed a long time. And then when it was released, it was to little fanfare. I mean, that movie effectively just like disappeared. Right. Whereas like even a few years before, Match Point and other movies of his were getting accolades.
Yeah. So it was like after Dylan Farrow came forward. I mean, she spoke about this before, but when the longer article that Dylan Farrow wrote, I think after that was, some of those movies have not been like even released or financially successful at all. Yeah, I think the last one I watched was Blue Jasmine.
That's probably the last one we saw in theaters. Yeah. And that, I mean, in a way, I mean, that was, but I think what's complicated about this whole thing, I think, is that there's like a momentum that seems to happen with these movements. And I mean, Me Too has been this huge avalanche of reckoning, I guess. And I think what I wonder is, what role do we as consumers have in supporting those victims so that they feel like they can come out and be safe in a way? Because prior to the Me Too movement, when people would do this publicly, come out publicly about someone, I mean, it would be news for a second and then just disappear. And they would their career could then be ruined by whoever was in power. And so there was, there's no incentive for them to come out. Then the institutional reform is not going to happen. So I'm not totally sure what that tipping point is and how that exactly, what the mechanisms of that, for Me Too works, and what role we as the consumers play in that. But I think insofar as we play some role in that, then I do think there is some obligation, because generating that kind of space for people to come out, basically be whistleblowers and not feel like their career is going to be destroyed, is, I think, an essential feature of at least any kind of lasting institutional reform.
No, I think that makes sense. And I think, you sort of point out that it's hard to say like what the mechanism is that like sort of makes these things successful. And I agree there's some ambiguity there. But I think one thing that makes a difference is going to be who is in the positions of power. So I think, one of the things that I, try to motivate in chapter 3 of my book is the idea that if we want institutional change in the art world, we're going to need change in the lineup of who's in positions of power in the art world. Art world broadly construed, right, to include things like the movie industry and things like that. So, I think that there's an important aspect of institutional reform that we need to achieve in terms of who is making those calls, because that will plausibly be part of the mechanism, right, of making other changes in the institutions.
Let me be explicit about that, actually, what you just said. So, because sometimes people talk about cancellation as this entirely negative thing. It's like, oh, we're just getting rid of the bad apples.
Yeah.
But what you're suggesting is a positive thing. It's a positive thing that we can advocate for, namely for diversifying the lineup of people who are in positions of power, who at least have different viewpoints about what matters, and have different perspectives on, and are we going to be more sensitive to different points of view when they're in the room making decisions about, what movie to green light and who to work with and what behaviors, tolerated.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think some aspects of the discussions about cancellation get really focused on sort of the after the fact thing, right? The fact that people are sort of like, oh, this movie came out with this person, this book was published, and this sort of after the fact backlash, and people are like, oh no, this is really bad. It's like censorship or something like that, right? But there's so little attention played to all of the filters that happen before the fact, right? Like all of the ways in which power is exercised to control, right, what we're exposed to in the first place, right? And I think that deserves just as much, probably more, right, attention in our thinking about how institutions operate than the sort of after the fact response to the decisions that are made.
Yeah. Do you think, this is a tough question, but do you think that there's anything that the individual consumer of art can do to make any kind of contribution to diversifying not just the people we see on the screen? Because I think we have some degree of power there, but, as consumers, but by diversifying the people behind, right, the producers because I feel like that's the really tricky, and I agree with you that that's the thing that needs diversifying as well, but it's not immediately clear to me if there's any role I can play as just a consumer of art in that regard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And one of the things that I, although I'm somewhat critical of sort of social media driven campaigns that focus on particular artists and boycotting particular artists in the book, because I have these worries that I was talking about with respect to their effectiveness and what they can really do. I don't want to suggest that there's no power that social media can have in this regard. So I think, one nice example of a social media campaign that I don't think is part of, or would be construed as part of any sort of like cancellation, but I think has some, had some significance, was the Oscars So White campaign. Right. Yeah. So like that was a social media driven campaign. It was one that, anybody with a social media account could like participate in amplifying. And its aim was changing an institution, right? Its aim was to try to change the composition of the Academy, right? So, that's just one small, right, part of the film industry. That's not going to change everything. But I think it's at least an example, right, of a kind of social media campaign that had an institutional goal and made some small progress towards trying to achieve that goal, because it shined a light on the composition of the Academy. So I think the more that people can sort of like shine a light on the composition of, different organizations in the art world, the more, pressure there can be to make changes there.
Here's one other thing that just came to mind is like, I think more than ever, film consumers these days are aware of facts about the process of making film than they've ever been before, and who's behind the scenes. Think about like Marvel. Everyone knows like, oh, it's this director and that director, and this director's terrible, and I love these movies because they had this, I love the Christopher Nolan Batmans, but I don't like the Snyder ones or whatever. Everyone has these distinctions that maybe they didn't have before, and that trickles down, I think, to as well, like bits of the internet. Like you could just look up who produced the movie. So it could be that with the ability to gain this knowledge, we have some obligation to know who is producing or contributing to various films, and actively seeking out, supporting and promoting films made by people who are outside of the usual canon of auteurs.
You mean anybody who's not a white man?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, this is difficult to do, but I think it's something that I think it can have both aesthetic benefits, because you'll find that you're watching things by people who have a completely different perspective from you, but also I think you might think that there's like a value here morally to contributing to the overall promotion of, again, this is done economically, but to the promotion of artists and producers who are struggling to get their foot in the door, right, so to speak. And again, as you put it, your point, just to echo your point from before, it may be that my buying the ticket isn't the thing that does it, but it could be that we all have a social media account, so being aware of how we use that account to promote things and what we're using it to promote, those are things that could matter morally and could have some significance, especially if you can get, anyone can go viral. That's, the wild thing about this today is that anyone can make a tweet that goes viral and like a hashtag movement can get started, in any moment. And so with that, you're sort of like, I don't know how to go viral, but
if you knew, Justin.
But here's the thing. But if you have the power to go viral, right? With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, that's
I just
true.
had to throw out the we were just talking Spider-Man. So, but what do you think about all this?
You want to go viral so bad, don't you?
I just want people to listen to this damn podcast. Okay. And part of that is getting it to be viral. So one of us needs to say some incredibly controversial thing. I'll pull it as the pull quote in the promotion of this episode, and then it'll go viral.
I'm gonna not
but in the worst way, and then they'll be like, cancel the cow.
No.
What do you think, Laura? What's going on?
I don't know. I think I actually had a very...
Laura's view is cancel all men. That's Laura's view.
Men are trash is kind of what I'm thinking. What did we learn from Ridley Scott's most latest movie?
Yeah.
I don't know what we learned from Gucci. I'm so excited to do that one day. But is that men are trash. That's the moral of Last Duel, right?
Yeah.
It's the moral that nobody got from the movie. Anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard. I'm wildly inconsistent on this, I think. I was having a text conversation with Emily Vanderwerth about this, and
man, you just name dropping Emily Vanderwerth.
I was. But I think she was talking about how she kind of had to reckon with Joss Whedon. Everybody has their darlings, right? The people like you with Woody Allen that mean so much to you growing up, and Woody Allen didn't mean so much to me growing up, so that one's easy for me to throw out. And with Rosemary's Baby, I'm just not going to stop watching Rosemary's Baby. I'm just not going to stop. I love that movie so much, and it's very icky that I know. So all who Roman Polanski is, and that he can't come back to the States, and that's like it's something I grapple with. But I think I'm also really inconsistent about I sort of pick the art that I like and is meaningful to me and find my way to feeling okay about watching it, and I use the bad actors as an excuse to not watch the art I don't want to watch. So I don't have any integrity on this, I feel. I apologize.
As this conversation is hopefully bringing out, it's complicated. I just want to echo two things, but one thing that Erich said, and then there's another point that Erich raised in the book that I want to bring up that, adds in even another layer of complication. But one of the things you said before, just to go back to the consequentialist or the non-consequentialist approach, and the other is this sort of signaling that somehow you signal that you don't care about the victims of this person who is a serial abuser. So actually, I'll just put it as a question, Erich. So what's your recommendation to someone? And I think this is something I felt for sure, about, okay, so you're now publicly, let's say, consuming The Usual Suspects. All three of us just did. How do we now avoid sending that signal that we don't care about the victims, by our watching the movie?
Well, I feel like the fact that our conversation is oriented around engaging with the accusations against Singer and Spacey is exactly how we avoid that signal. So, I don't want to and I was just writing sort of like a follow-up piece about this, because I think there is a worry that the way in which in the book I argue that, we need to be more careful ethically when it comes to our public engagement than with our private engagement because of sort of the message that we might send. There's this worry that might impinge on all of the sort of social dimensions of our engagement with the arts, right? Like, we don't just watch movies and, by ourselves and then like not talk about them, right? We watch them and we talk about them with friends. And so, I don't want to give the impression that that's like all now verboten. I think that the worrisome case that I want to avoid, and part of the reason I want to avoid it is because it has such like obvious champions, right? Are the people who just really explicitly think like none of these accusations matter because we're talking about great artists, right? So like you see stuff like this in the op-ed pages all the time where people say some version of like, oh, well, like, like only like kind of like messed up people make great art and it's worth it to have their work and stuff like that. And I feel like those attitudes are really repugnant, right? Like, I don't want to endorse the idea that it's just worth it, right, to have the usual suspects, right, that Bryan Singer did these terrible things. Like, I don't think that's worth it, right? But that's a different question than sort of like, well, what do we do with this work now that we have it, right? If we could go back in time, right, and prevent some kids from being sexually assaulted, right, and not have the usual suspects, I don't find that to be a hard choice, right? Like, obviously, like, save the kids, right? But that's a different question from this one that we face with the work in front of us. So I think as long as we're not ignoring the accusations, we're not sweeping them under the rug, we're not acting as if the work is itself just justification for whatever the artist does, I think we move ourselves into a more morally sort of acceptable space. That doesn't mean it's not going to be an uncomfortable space, right? Like, right. It inevitably will be. But I don't think that we need to sort of stop talking about the movie or not seeing the movie because of these sorts of worries, because we can sort of cancel those negative implications.
Yeah, that's right, and I think that's a very sensible response. The one thing I really liked about the book is you raise a lot of interesting complications, but there's a very grounded approach to this stuff. There's I never felt like now Eric's going off on some radical tangent, which like, oh my God, it's all very well argued and grounded and sensible. But let me raise one other issue, which is in every case is different. And you raised the case of the you're gonna have to remind me of the name of the song, but the age ain't nothing but a number.
Yes,
the R. Kelly.
Yes, R. Kelly.
Oh, so that's tough, and I think the interaction between the content of the art and what the artist has done, that's a really fraught and interesting and complicated thing. And all right, so at the top, I hinted that there is a little bit of that going on in this movie because. This movie is about a guy who, Kaiser Soze, who's like the ultimate evil gangster guy. And Soze basically is in the entire movie gaslighting this detective, Dave Kuyan, and the audience by proxy the entire time, right? He's this ultimate criminal mastermind, but he portrays himself as weak, someone who has a disability, somebody who is passive. Right, he's often the one who is being kind of. All the other guys are macho, and he's the meek one in the corner. So he's, in a way, it's like so obvious it was him all along. That's like this trope now. But like when it's set, the movie is set up to make you think it couldn't possibly be him. He's like the weakest of the bunch, and I think there's something similar that happens with people like Bryan Singer and Kevin Spacey, who they want to portray themselves in public as if they are they're not guys who would prey on someone. They're just like nice guys. I mean, I think the view I had of Kevin Spacey throughout the 90s was like, he's like an actor, right? He's a stage actor. He's just serious about the craft. Right? There might be these other guys like maybe Mel Gibson. He throws a phone at somebody, he's an asshole or whatever. But that's not Kevin Spacey. He's just like a mild manner. He just wants to be like an actor. And I don't know so much about Singer, but my sense was always like, yeah, Singer just like he did the X-Men movies and he's a superhero guy. And he just wants to be a director and he's interested in these kind of nerdy things. I mean, we just talked about Joss Whedon. There was just an article today in Vulture about Joss Whedon, and again, how he sort of portrayed himself as this nerd, mild-mannered nerd ally, feminist ally who, and then it came out that he was actually abusive towards women on sets and so on. And now Joss Whedon is effectively canceled. And I think like there is a parallel here. And, what are we to make of the film in light of the fact that both of these guys are in a way delighting in doing the very thing sort of on screen that they're kind of were doing in real life? It adds, I think, a dimension of complexity to our enjoyment of the film.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting angle. And I think it's a sort of in this case, it's a more subtle resonance with the accusations against the director and the actor than I think we are often used to thinking about in this space, right? So, like I was talking about Woody Allen and how Woody Allen in his movies has got like always having these like relationships with young girls. It's like all over the place. You brought up the Age Ain't Nothing But a Number, right? Like, what's so disturbing about Age Ain't Nothing But a Number is that basically R. Kelly, who wrote this song, is using his child bride's like singing as a mouthpiece for like defending his own actions, right? I mean, it's like those kinds of cases are so stark. Whereas I feel like, yes, I see what you're saying about the way in which, famous, artists, celebrities can, manipulate the public through presenting a certain kind of veneer. And then behind that, they're maybe doing terrible things. And there's a similar sort of like manipulation happening in the movie. But I think there's more distance in this case because, it's not as if it's about a movie. It's not as if it's a movie about a guy who's like presenting a veneer so that he can like prey on, boys, right? Like that's right. So it's when I sat down to watch the movie this time, right, where I was really watching it to like think about, right, the relationship between the work and the accusations against the Spacey and Singer, the thing that actually stood out to me the most maybe was just the sort of casual homophobia in the movie.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which, it's hard to know how to read that, right? Like, because first I thought, well, maybe this is just like sort of mid-90s. And if I sat down and watched a whole bunch of mid-90s movies at the same time, I'd be like, oh, well, casual homophobia, really ubiquitous. And that's probably true. But then, thinking about it in this light, I was wondering like, oh, is this a kind of like deflection? Is it sort of like, you're like, oh yeah, like Singer, he's like, in with the sort of casual homophobia. So like, he's not, party to these things that people might, like think about him. Right. And I wasn't sure how to read that, but it definitely it was salient for me in a way that it hadn't been salient before. But it's also possible it was salient for me because I hadn't watched the movie in a long time and I'm more sensitive about things than I was when I was in high school.
I mean,
yeah, no, I don't have anything to add.
Okay, I thought you were pointing out the same thing to me. You were like, yeah, this thing is filled. I mean, we watched The Departed, I don't know, a couple of years ago, rewatched and we were like, holy crap, the first 10 minutes, 5 minutes of The Departed is just like full of racial slurs. It's like really, it's sort of jarring, but I do think like there is, that those times have changed. Yeah, I mean, I just to think a little bit about the, what I think I find somewhat uncomfortable about this is that I like what Verbal and thus Singer do in their deception. I think it's really interesting and cool, but knowing that these are two guys who have profited greatly from being deceptive, like in this very same way in real life, that is, and I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that in a second. I just find myself like, it's a little bit like admiring, someone for doing something that, in real life, they've sort of, that's not the bad thing they've done in real life, or it's part of the bad thing they've done in real life. Maybe it's not the worst bad thing, but it's the thing that has enabled them to keep doing. It's the skill set that's enabled them to keep doing the bad stuff.
Bryan Singer, in one of the quotes from the Atlantic article, said that's one of the things I like most about filmmaking or movie making: the sense of power manipulating an audience. That's his special skill set.
I mean,
and he uses it for amazing art, and he uses it to the detriment of many people around him.
Yeah. Not to get all philosophy professor about this, but it reminds me of Kant. Kant talks about the coolness of the scoundrel, right? Sort of like the way in which, right, certain skills, right, might be admirable, right, used in some contexts, but not in other contexts. And so maybe this is like an example of that, where it's like, oh yeah, we can admire the manipulativeness of the director in the context of their artwork, but it becomes a very different thing when it's being used to for sort of nefarious ends.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of that same article also talked a lot about how Bryan Singer's team and the people around him use the symptoms that flow from trauma to undermine the credibility of the people that tried to come out and speak against him, which, whether it was like substance abuse or, holes in their stories or something like the very trauma that came from Singer, he then used against those people in order to discredit them and humiliate them and silence them. It's just, there's a kind of insight into that psychology that I think that Bryan Singer has and that Kevin Spacey has and that Verbal has as well. Verbal's reading what Kujan wants to know and wants to hear and is feeding that story right back to him in order to get what he wants.
Yeah. The way Verbal is written in his interaction with Kujan is super interesting. So he figures out Kujan like instantly. He figures out that Kujan wants to pin the blame on Keaton. So what he does is he doesn't say, oh yeah, it's Keaton. Because he knows that's not what's going to make Kujan that's not going to confirm what Kujan wants. He knows that Kujan's a detective. He wants the breadcrumbs, right? He wants to feel like he can convince Verbal that that Keaton's the bad guy. So that's what Verbal does. Verbal takes up the other side. His whole story is that Keaton's a good guy, right? Keaton's like this. He's totally changed his mind. He's gone clean and everything. And then he gets pulled back in to do this one last job. And then it all kind of goes sour. Keaton's not the bad guy. But he leaves enough cracks in the story for Kujan to break it up and to like overpower him. And he also knows that, because Kujan says this explicitly, I'm smarter than you. I got what I wanted to know out of him.
He calls him stupid all the time.
Yeah.
It also would have been a bad movie if Verbal had just been like, oh yeah, it's Keaton. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Because for the same reason, remember, the audience is Kujan. He's our audience surrogate. We
want to feel smart.
We want to feel smart. Yeah. And we also want an engaging narrative, right? We want to feel like we want to go through the whole process and try to figure out the mystery ourselves. We're just like a detective, right? It's like a mystery noir. We want to piece the puzzle together. So they give us that. But they're giving it to us in this unreliable way, in this way that like is effectively gaslighting us, ready to pull the rug out from us at the end. And I think what's also kind of interesting and sadistic is that like about Verbal's behavior is that Verbal, like a lot of the stuff he puts in the story that he pulls off of the background of the bulletin board. Yeah. It's totally irrelevant, right? Yeah. It's just like a bunch of like nonsense stuff that doesn't matter. But he puts it in there, I think, because he wants Kujan to find out. He wants him to figure out that he was lying to him the whole time, but he doesn't want him to figure it out until he stopped talking to him and turned around. Right. And he's already out the door. I think there's something totally sadistic about that. Like I'm going to lie to you, but I'm not even I'm going to lie to you in a way which will allow you to figure out the truth, but when it's too late, I just think, and of course it's the same thing with Singer. He of course wants us to know the truth in the fictional truth in the story, but until it's too late, so to speak. Like because he gives us the fake out ending, right? He gives us the ending where it looks like it's Keaton. Oh man. And if you were kind of a savvy, noir watcher at the time, you'd be like, I called it. I knew it was Keaton, right? Because he's already giving you enough clues that maybe it is Keaton. Then he reveals it is Keaton. And then you go, I got it. And then he pulls that rug out from under you. And then you feel fucking dumb, right? You feel like you just got had. And I think that's partly what makes it such a good twist ending. But it's also kind of sadistic, right? It's kind of like, he really messed you up as an audience member. And that's what leaves you with that feeling of like destabilization, I think, when you leave the theater, when you shamble out and you go like, oh my God. If it didn't have that double fake out, I don't think it would be as effective.
Yeah, no, I think the double twist is really what's doing it for the movie in terms of that that success there. And I mean, I think also, so this is not a very philosophical point, but I was on my mind watching the movie, so I'm just going to say it. Is I think that the cleverness of the movie that we are enjoying here, right, with the cleverness of the writing, of the directing, I really feel like that is what carries Kevin Spacey's character in this. Watching this movie again, I was like, I'm not blown away by Kevin Spacey's acting in this movie. And maybe it's also because all the other actors are so good. Like, I feel like this movie is like really stacked with acting talent. I mean, Benicio del Toro's character, I mean, how many lines?
Amazing.
How many lines does he even have in the movie? Like 15 lines, 20 lines? But he's like, amazing, right? Or like the line where, like, you know, when Verbal is first introduced, he's like, well, my name is Roger, and people call me Verbal because I talk too much. And Kevin Pollak's like, yeah, I was just about to tell you to shut up. Like, what? the way he delivers that line is just so excellent. Anyway, I didn't even remember, you know, that Giancarlo Esposito is in this movie. And like, he like makes something, I mean, it's not like his best performance, but he makes something out of a completely throwaway character, right? That character was there solely for moving the narrative along. But like, I think he makes him sort of like an interesting, sort of compelling, you know, figure. And I think sort of especially viewed in that light, I don't know. I feel like, you know, Kevin Spacey is the one who got the accolades, but I feel like the other people were really carrying the attribution of success to that role.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I just on the Giancarlo Esposito thing, I love the part. There's like a great joke in the movie when he's on the phone and the Hungarian guy is like,
look, the guy they pulled out of the harbor is Arkash Kovacs. I can't hear you. Shut up, I'm on the phone.
I just love that. It's a good line.
Totally
delivers it really well. But Lauren, you weren't as taken by the acting. Do you want to? I mean, it's okay.
No, I agree with you about Benicio del Toro. I think I read that he like decided with McHugh to that he would just like be completely incomprehensible almost, that have like that accent that like nobody understands him, partially because like there's not so much that his character does. As you point out, there's like 20 lines, and I get like Singer thought it was like a joke at first, and then he was like, this guy's really just here to die. Like that's his point. So like, why not let Benicio del Toro do his thing and go to town? So he's having a real meal out of it. I wasn't as blown away by Baldwin, or I found
Gabriel
Byrne a little hard to buy.
That's interesting, yeah.
Personally, he's so genteel to me. I just didn't like understand him as a dirty cop who was like shivving people right and left in prison. Like killed three people in prison. I'm like, that guy?
But can I try to make a defense of him in particular? I mean, remember that we're watching Verbal's his portrayal of fictionalized portrayal of this character.
Criticism's baked in.
Maybe the criticism's baked in, right? Maybe where he's supposed to be softer, portrayed softer, because that's how Verbal is telling the story. But maybe he is more of a hard ass kind of guy,
right? So maybe he's more of the guy that Kuyan says he is in reality, right? But we're watching Verbal's version of this, where he's like just sort of mooning after Edie and looking cool in modern apartments.
I have to say, I really do like the like shots of him just like, especially when they do the fake out reveal of him as Kaiser, and he's, you know, just him like, he's kind of like, just like, you know, he's moving his finger along his mouth and he's kind of glancing around furtively. He's channeling Pacino in Godfather. You know, he has that kind of like machinating vibe to him. And I think that's another reason why he's a great choice for someone who is potentially a Kaiser Soze, right? Because he kind of looks like he could be, as you say, he's the most genteel. He looks like he could be a criminal mastermind. Like maybe he's not shivving people, but there's a possibility that this guy is actually the one who's pulling the strings, right? He dresses better than everyone else. He's high class. They're mostly low class. So you kind of get the sense that, yeah, maybe this guy is some like Turkish crime lord, even though he's obviously Irish.
Yeah, I feel like they, you know, like each of the five guys, they just like, they each have their role to play, and it sort of fits together nicely, right? And you get that, of course, illustrated in that, very early opening shot with the lineup that became, synonymous with the movie, where just in the way that they each read their line, right? You already get this little snapshot of what each of those characters is going to be, right? Like McManus is kind of unhinged, right? And so he reads the line like a lunatic, and like Benicio del Toro is like not clear like what he even said, and everybody's laughing.
Incoherent.
Right?
What the fuck?
Yeah. I mean, McManus's best line in the movie is definitely when he's set up as the sniper and he sings,
Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I-O. And on the farm he shot some guys. Bada boom, bada bing, bang, boom.
This movie is not sort of like rife with comedic moments, but like I feel like when they come, they're all special.
Yeah, I feel like they're jokes. I like them, and I always liked Stephen Baldwin's character. Honestly, when I saw this movie when I was a kid, I was like, why have I never seen this guy? Like I hadn't seen other and I was like, he's got to be a famous actor. He just felt like a movie star. He looked like a movie star to me.
Because he looked like Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, he looks like Alec Baldwin.
They all kind of
not that I was confused. Yeah, but he just has a look. He has this kind
He's
of
got piercing blue eyes.
Yeah. And then Kevin Pollak looks like he just walked off the streets of Queens.
Yeah.
Like these guys are really good character actors, I think. And I think it's great to populate your noir with character actors who sort of are all like too smart, in a way, or too street savvy. And then they all start getting killed off. And then you're like, oh shit. It just makes the stakes seem so high. Like, holy crap, these guys are so
like
competent.
The most badass.
Yeah, or like the other one, like can we talk about like the delivery from what's his name, the sergeant whose office he's using for the interview? That guy. I don't even know his name, but that guy.
I think of him as Cher's dad.
Dan Hedaya.
Yeah,
that guy.
He's a detective in like a million movies, right?
Yeah,
but,
he's also Cher's dad in Clueless.
Exactly. Right. That guy. But like, I mean. He's fantastic, right? And he has almost no. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is just sort of nostalgia or something. But one of the things I thought while watching this movie was like, gosh, they don't make them like this anymore. Like it's so tight, and everybody's doing their little part, even when it's a little thing. And it didn't feel like there was a lot of slack, and I feel like a lot of movies that today try to be this kind of movie, sort of like a mystery drama kind of thing. I don't know. I never feel like I'm as satisfied with them as the classics of the classics of the 90s.
The classics. Yeah, I feel like it's a classic. I feel like it is. Yeah. I mean, to your point, I said the same thing to Laura. I said, these guys all feel like men. And I feel like when they cast people of this age now, they don't feel like men. And maybe that's just because I'm now the same age as these actors.
We're old.
Yeah,
I think that's a really old thing to say.
No, but these guys do feel like, I don't know, they feel grizzled and like street worn in a way that like, Shia LaBeouf does. But Shia LaBeouf will always, because I've seen him as a child actor, always feel like a kid, even when he's like got tattoos and is being super gruff or whatever, and that's the best example I can think of. I just think like Gosling, he's too pretty, right? All these guys now, you made that point actually, Laura, last night. You were like, yeah, everyone now is too pretty or too jacked. They look like they're like been spent all their time in the gym.
Or at the spa.
And these guys just look like they're like Hockney. When he's repairing a car, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally bought him.
Yeah, and speaking of the singer oeuvre, I remember seeing a thing that was sort of illustrating this very change that we're talking about, and sort of the portrayal of the male sort of hero figure from like around 2000 to now, via how Hugh Jackman was presented as Wolverine from like the first X-Men movie all the way up through like all the X-Men movies. And then like in the first X-Men movie, which is Bryan Singer, right? Like he's just sort of like, he's like looks fit, but he's just like a regular dude. And then like by the end, he's this like totally like swole, crazy, like gym fiend. And it's like, wow, he's
like more veins than man.
Yes, exactly. More veins than man. That's so well said. And it's like, that was a real change in the way that this kind of, leading man was presented over time. It's really remarkable.
It is. I don't know. I don't think it's a great trend. Well, I don't know. Who am I to say? Whatever. Do you like it, Laura?
Absolutely not.
Do heterosexual women or gay men like it? Because if that's fine, that's good for me.
I mean, I can't speak for all heterosexual women and gay men. That's crazy. But
you're one of them. So
I am a heterosexual woman, and I am very uncomfortable when men are like shiny and enormous and their biceps are larger than, as you pointed out, Justin, your own torso.
Well,
that is not. That's not for me. But it's for other people.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, whatever. I hope somebody's satisfied with that.
Yeah, don't yuck other people's yums.
No way. We're not doing that. Can I make one other thought of just? I thought this was really funny. I looked this up and I confirmed it. So, Soze in Turkish means talks too much. And if you actually go to Google Translate and you type in Soze and you go Turkish to English, it translates as verbal.
Ah.
So if you speak Turkish, this movie was a bust for you because you knew.
Yep.
As soon as they mentioned.
I wonder if they had to change it. Maybe in the Turkish one, they had to
maybe
change it to Kaiser Nose,
yeah.
All right, exactly. I have a colleague who's Turkish, and I'm going to ask her whether she saw this movie and whether it was ruined.
Yeah, but again, I think that's one of these things where just like verbal leaves the clues for the movie's leaving you all the clues, right? It leaves this stuff there so that when you go back, you can be like, damn. The other question I had for you guys was, I think like any good deceiver, verbal integrates, I think, the truth and the lies. I think it's not just a completely fabricated story. Like, I think the first time I saw this, I was like, oh my God, unreliable narrator. Everything I saw was false. But I think that's wrong because, as we know, Kuyan goes to arrest Keaton. So the stuff that we're seeing about, like, immediately after the lineup, presumably is happening, at least he integrates the lineup into his story. And also, I'm guessing New York's taxi service thing or whatever, New York's famous taxi service, I'm guessing that happened in the sense that he probably put something in there that is verifiable, that because presumably the cop knew about that because he's a New York cop. Or I guess he's a customs guy, but he seems like he's based in New York. So I think it's interesting that, again, he integrates the truth and the falsity. And it's kind of a fun exercise, I guess, to just try to figure out which parts of the story are accurate. Like we know, for instance, Redfoot is not a real guy. Yeah, that name appears on or at least he gave a different name to him. But and I don't know. I was wondering if you guys had any other thoughts about which parts might have been true and which parts might have been false.
Yeah, I feel that the most with Kobayashi, right? Because you're like, oh, okay, Kobayashi is the name of this coffee cup ceramics company or whatever that they have at the police department. But then, Pete Postlethwaite picks him up in the car at the end of the movie. So you're like, oh, well, that's a real guy. But it's so hard, I think, as an audience member to put your finger on who the actor is supposed to be representing in that scene when he picks up verbal at the end, right? Because you know that there is something that was totally off about that part of the story, having been inspired, in part by just a thing that he saw in The Office, right? So it's I think we're supposed to think of him as, still sort of oh, well, he's a Kaiser Soze representative. Here he is picking up Kaiser Soze. But beyond that, we don't really know that much about him, whether he was the person who did these things as depicted in the movie or not, right? Yeah, Laura, what do you think?
I don't know. You've watched it way more than me.
I guess I just think it's an interesting case of trying to sort out what the fictional truth is, right? So what's true in this fiction? And I think there's a certain degree of indeterminacy, but I think it's less indeterminate than I think I had previously thought. Whereas I thought I guess he was lying, so anything could have been true, anything could be false. I actually think there might be elements of it. And I think that, again, tells something interesting about the role of deception, because I think that is an important part of being a successful deceiver, is to not just make up all kinds of bullshit, but to make up stuff that is integrated with the truth in the right kind of way, so that when people verify those elements of your story, they think, oh, that's right. And then they think, okay, well, the rest of it must have also been true as well. So there's something savvy about that.
Yeah. And on that point, there's this really short shot very early on in the movie. And now, even though I watched it today, I couldn't tell you if it was before the lineup or after the lineup. It might even have been before the lineup, where you have verbal. I think he's giving the deposition, like the deposition that gets him the immunity that they're talking about all throughout the movie. There's like a 2-second shot of him like with mics and lights on him, and he's like, it all started 6 weeks ago, kind of thing, right?
Yep.
Where it's like, I think that even from the very beginning, we're getting Verbal's version of the
Interesting.
story.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. It's unclear whether what we're seeing in the flashbacks is real or Verbal telling the story at the deposition or whatever. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But I thought that was real, but yeah.
Well, but I mean, you're right in the sense that like the lineup must have happened because, like you said, like Kuyan is like there because of this lineup situation ultimately. But there is, I think, that sort of introduction of unreliability by this like. And it goes by so fast. I was like, wait, where is he? And it was only later. It's like, oh no, that was him giving the deposition.
Yeah. I mean, this is a cool movie. I mean, look, it's a cool movie. I feel like there's a lot to unpack. I think it's an interesting movie. And the thing that makes me feel uncomfortable is I think the movie is made weirdly more interesting by the fact that these two guys have been deceivers for so long. That is crazy to say, but I actually think it makes the movie strangely more interesting because it adds a new angle through which to think about the deception that's playing out in this movie. I don't know how quite to feel. I feel uncomfortable, but I also feel like maybe I just should feel uncomfortable about that. Maybe that's just where I should be sitting.
I think that's right. I think sometimes these things do make the works more interesting aesthetically, but in a way that feels messed up because of how that interest is predicated on this. I say something in the book, like in passing about this when I'm talking about, I think it's in the last chapter where I'm talking a little bit about Gauguin again. And it's like, the more, like the works are already uncomfortable if you have eyes, right? But the more you learn about Gauguin, I think the more uncomfortable they get in a way that is also interesting, right? Again, not in a way that justifies, right? But it's there.
Can I go back to the Let Me Be Frank video?
Oh,
I mean, I don't.
Did you end up watching it?
I mean,
I did watch it, and this is the first time I saw it. Is you guys sent it to me, and I watched it, and I was like,
"Oh no, I'm so sorry."
Okay, what did you think?
Earth is happening here.
What did you think, Eric? Give me like a semi-live reaction.
Oh my, I don't even know what to say. I mean, like, yeah. So, it seemed like a psychotic break. I'm not a psychologist, so I mean, take that with a grain of salt. But no, I mean, it seemed like a retreat, right? Kevin Spacey retreated into the Frank Underwood character.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is a bizarre move because that character is a moral monster.
Yeah.
So what on earth? I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I was thinking about like when you mentioned in any other industry besides like, the entertainment industry, the movie industry, we wouldn't be, these predators wouldn't be allowed, wouldn't to be reach these heights of success and receive all these accolades. So there is this, I mean, of course there's like this like obsession with genius and celebrity, and as we found with the Bryan Singer story and with Kevin Spacey and with Harvey Weinstein and every story that Ronan Farrow has brought out, like there's like a cabal basically of people propping this behavior up, allowing it to happen, covering it up, making sure there are reprisals for people who try to speak out about it. But the weird thing too is that like Kevin Spacey has seemed to think that like the audience wants him to be a moral monster because we find it fun to watch him be a moral monster. And in the video, he's saying like, you want me back. He's played enough horrible human beings and we've eaten it up that he's like, I can act with impunity now because they love me when I'm bad. Like he's like had this like strange psychosis that like somehow the audience was like feeding it back into him, thinking like I can act this way because I act this way on screen and people like praise me for it.
Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit like he's pointing the finger at the audience. Like you're complicit in my bad behavior because you liked it when I was Frank Underwood. And so you should like it when I'm in real life sexually assaulting people. And you're like, wait a second, Kevin Spacey, one is fantasy and one is real.
Laura, you were just making reference back to something I said earlier about how if these people weren't celebrities, and sort of we knew about these things they'd done, people wouldn't work with them. We wouldn't let it happen. And then as you were saying that, I was like, oh no, wait, this happens in academia all the time. And I was like, oh man. And that's messed up. And
it is
we need reform as well.
Yes. I think what it amounts to ultimately is whenever you have a scarcity of resources and you have people who have, for whatever reason, historical accident, achieved a certain degree of power within, that they become gatekeepers of those resources. And then you have other people who are powerless but desire to be in that circle. They're just they're going to be exploited. It could very well be that it makes it, I mean, you have to look at the calculation, but it could very well be rational for these people self-interestedly to let themselves be exploited, but for two, turn the blind eye to the behavior. Because, when you're in a situation of collective action uncertainty, to risk being the one who's an ally who supports an accusation like this is to effectively risk your career, right? In as much as you're trying to do the right thing to help this person, you end up risking your career. And so I think that it's a sort of structural problem that you could sort of, and when you think about it, I think abstractly, you kind of see, I could see why this thing would perpetuate, because it's not like you get a bunch of people and then they suddenly become evil when you put them in an institution, but it's that they got money and they don't want to lose that money, and they're not going to, there's only so much that they're going to be motivated by whatever they think is the right thing to do, and they're going to act, they're going to rationalize their behavior. It's very easy to rationalize your behavior in circumstances like this, where it's a lot of times the allegations are through rumors and hearsay and very difficult to verify. And so I think it just, creates a cycle. And I don't know how to reform that. I think it's a really difficult situation. But I also think none of us are doing this, but I also think it's hard to sort of cast aspersions on any particular person. Of course, you should cast aspersions on the bad actors, but it's hard to cast aspersions on the people who are propping them up, even though we think that they are doing the wrong thing. But you can sort of see why it would be reasonable from their perspective to not say anything. And I think that makes it just really, really complicated.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, legal solutions are not always the best solution either, because the legal situation is incredibly complicated and is set up for good reason to err on the side of innocence, and which is good. I mean, that's a good thing for all kinds of reasons. But so it's a really complicated situation that we find ourselves in, and I think maybe my recommendation to the audience is go watch Usual Suspects, the movie rules, and don't think about it. No, I'm just kidding.
No, watch it and do think about it.
Watch it. Exactly. Watch it and then read Erich's book.
That's right. So to finish up, let me just plug the book. So the book is called Drawing the Line: What to Do with the Work of Immoral Artists from Museums to Movies. It's by Oxford University Press. It's a breezy read. You do not need to have a PhD in philosophy to read this. No. And you will come away from reading this with, I think, a deeper understanding of these issues that we've been talking about today. And hopefully then you'll also be in a better position to think for yourself about what you want to do with this very complicated predicament that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I need to read this book because I, as I said, am wildly inconsistent and have no integrity on this. So I'll be reading it soon.
Awesome.
Thank you for writing it, Erich. I think it's a really important book.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for this really fun conversation.
Thanks also for being here. So, Erich, can you tell the folks, besides the book, do you want to promote your Twitter account?
I'm also terrible at Twitter. Yeah, sure. You can follow me on Twitter at ehatmatt. I tweet sometimes, but not often.
Excellent. Follow Erich on Twitter, and we are on Twitter at CowsPod, and you can find us on the web at cowspod.wordpress.com. And continuing this theme of engaging in philosophical aspects of art, we're going to be talking with Matt Stroll next time about the movie Twilight and about his new book, Why It's Okay to Love Bad Movies. So tune in for that.